Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so great to have you here at Central Synagogue with us tonight. My name is Shira Epstein. I'm the Senior Director of Adult Engagement here at Central Synagogue. It's a joy to be with you this evening. The focus of our Israel programs this year are bringing our community together to hear stories that take us past the headlines, into people's lives and real experiences, expanding the conversation just a touch beyond the war, to be able to be thinking more of what's happening moving ahead. Tonight's event is the first in launching our Israel-focused programs, Ambassador Daniel Taub in conversation with Rabbi Sarah Berman. And we are thrilled that you're here to be with us for this kickoff program of our Israel-focused programs. Ambassador Daniel Taub is a diplomat, international lawyer, and writer. He has represented Israel in peace negotiations with its neighbors and as ambassador to the United Kingdom. He lectures widely about conflict resolution in foreign ministries and universities around the world. He is an accredited mediator, which we need right now, and runs difficult conversation laboratories, bringing together participants from different ideological backgrounds. Taub has written drama for Israeli television and theater for the London stage. A popular lecturer on biblical texts, he is the author of Parasha Diplomatit, a collection of diplomatic insights on the Bible. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife Zehava, and they have 6 children. So without further ado, Daniel Taub and Rabbi Sarah Berman.
Thank you so much, Shira. We really appreciate this. And we appreciate all of you coming this evening, showing up for the very beginning of our Israel programming for 5786. So as promised, we want to begin with the person before we get to the expertise, and you are here for both reasons, clearly. Ambassador Taub, Daniel, tell us who you are and tell us about your calling into diplomacy and public service.
So first of all, what a total pleasure. I have already had the highlight of this evening, which was that I went into the community house across the road, and I do not remember a synagogue that I've been in, and I spend an awful lot of time in synagogues in Europe, where there are that number of young, energized Jewish teenagers that are grappling, and it was just extraordinary. And to be in a synagogue that is thriving today and is planting the seeds for thriving for the future is a really beautiful experience.
Well, and what Daniel didn't know when he walked in, and what the students still don't know, is that, they were debating a solution to the Israel-Palestine crisis, the question of an Israel, a Palestine, 2 peoples, this land.
If I had been there 20 years ago, the Middle East might have looked different, with their ideas. I also want to say what a pleasure it's been, preparing for this evening. I want to thank Marina, who has been a total pleasure on the organizational front, and our preparatory conversations, my conversations with Rabbi Sarah have been so interesting that I hope this one comes close because it's marvelous. So the question that you said used a phrase that I think most Israelis would not identify with. And you talked about public service as being a calling.
Right. Much like the clergy or
and
medicine.
The honest truth is, if you were to ask Israelis who had made the most major contribution to Israeli society, I don't think public servants would come top of the list. I think they would think about the people who had come up with great technological inventions, or the business people who have employed large numbers of people, maybe from the disadvantaged sectors, Arabs, Ethiopians, and so on and so forth. And, I don't think we have that same sense that sometimes you have abroad, that we have the public servants who are contributing, because it's such a young country. Everybody is. But just to say a word about my journey in the public service. So I moved to Israel about 37 years ago, and I started working as a lawyer, an intellectual property, a commercial lawyer, and then the peace process broke out, and they started negotiations. Some of you may remember the Madrid conference and so on, and there were missing negotiators. And I happened to have a master's in international law, And so I thought, you know what I'll do? I'll take a couple of months out. We'll wrap up this peace deal. And then I'll go back and then I'll earn some money. It didn't quite work out that way. I ended up sort of stuck in public service. But it really did touch me quite deeply. I remember the first time we went down to Sharm el-Sheikh, and I was like a real young member of the negotiating team, and it was Israelis and Palestinians, and they were stuck on a particular issue, and I walked in, and I said, well, what if we did it this way? And they said, that would work. And it gave you this total sense of agency, that you could, in your own way, bring about some sort of change. And one time a European diplomat came to me before he left Israel to go back to Europe, and he said to me, I'm very jealous of you Israeli diplomats because you really feel you have a mission. And I thought he picked up on something. There is something about Jewish history that is reflected in the way you conduct your diplomacy.
So this is, what called you, what spoke to you in your shift from law into diplomacy. Now, as a former diplomat, possibly future diplomat again, but as someone who has this as part of your history, but not part of your present, you, like every other Israeli, have been experiencing the last 2 years since October 7th, from the attack through the war, the ups, the downs, the ceasefires, the hostage exchanges, through the ceasefire of last week. Can you tell us a little bit, as a person, how the last couple of years have affected you and your family?
So the honest truth is I still speak in the media sometimes, but I don't speak about this. And I don't speak about this because I almost don't trust myself to speak about it. I've done a certain number of things over the past 2 years, helping the foreign ministry in some of its strategizing, helping a number of hostage families in their thinking about what might be most effective. But if you ask me what has affected me most, I would say it's the fact that I have 5 sons and 1 son-in-law who have spent, some of them all, and all of them much, of the past 2 years in their combat units on the front line. And that has so profoundly deepened the cocktail of emotions that all of us are feeling. And you feel, alongside the frustration and the fear and the concern and the whatever, you feel a sense of deep, deep pride at this extraordinary purposefulness that, I think it's a generation that surprised itself. On October the 8th, the planes out, it's incredible. On October the 8th, already actually on October the 7th, the planes out of Israel were empty. And the planes into Israel, into this war zone, were full. And they were full of backpackers from Nepal and techie people who had been in Seattle and whatever, because they realized that they were the line of defense of their families from these attacks. One of them said, it's us, it's the TikTok generation that has been good, and there was that. And something quite significant for all of the complexity has changed over the past couple of weeks. And if you were to ask me what it was, first of all, with the return of the hostages, I think as a society, we couldn't even begin the grieving process for the past 2 years because we were in some way locked into October the 7th. And now, it's not the end of anything, but it may be the beginning of a process of grieving, of healing, and so on. And the other thing that I think we are starting to feel is a kind of sense of agency returning to us. After 2 years of feeling powerless, and I have to say, one of the things about this younger generation, my kids included, they come back from the army and you would think they would want to rest, they would want to, I don't know what. they all of them, or many of them, want to engage in social projects for the betterment of Israeli society. I have one of my sons who was called down south on October the 7th, who had friends dying in his arms, who used to work for a medical tech company, has left that job with friends to start up a movement to improve the quality of Israel's leadership. And I don't think he's untypical. And if you talked about a calling, I don't know if I felt the calling so much, but I think there's something in this younger generation that in a way realizes, yes, Israel's been around for 70 years, but we need to be a founding generation. We are called to set up to the plate.
You talk about this as being a moment of inflection between what was and what is coming into being. One of the things that's coming into being is your book, Beyond Dispute. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the lessons that we can learn about constructive disagreement, about moving beyond dispute in this moment, especially as we're shifting from a time that is driven really by military decisions into a time that will be following the diplomatic lead.
In so many ways, we are at a critical inflection point, as you said, and I think one of the major heavy questions that is hovering over Israel at the moment is, do we go back to the situation on October the 6th, prior to October the 7th, when Israel was the most divided that it has been in its short history, ostensibly over an obscure constitutional issue, a legal issue, but really over fundamental conflicting visions of what this country should be like, with a very toxic public debate? Or is there something, as you ask, from these past 2 years that can help us rise above it? And I think the jury is out, but I think there are a number of points of light that we have to hold fast to. So if I was speaking about young kids in the army, I think one of the things that's so striking is that they come back, for their weekends away, their weekends home, and you see there is this moment of incomprehension when they look at the divisions in Israeli society. And they're saying, we have just spent weeks, perhaps months, in foxholes, in tanks, with people who have radically different religious views, radically different political views, and we have been watching out for each other's backs. How can you, and I think we need to ask ourselves, where are those foxholes? Where are those tanks within Israeli society? Where are those moments that we can, and there are, by the way. In my neighborhood in Jerusalem, a very tragic death was, all the deaths are tragic, but was one of a very beloved teacher by the name of Avi Goldberg. He has, I think, 8 children. And his wife, Rachel, and the family knew that there would be many, many people who wanted to come and comfort them at the Shiva, including political leaders. And they made a decision. They said, we welcome anyone to come, any politician, to come and visit us in our Shiva, on one condition. They come as pairs, one member of the opposition with one member of the coalition. And that's exactly what they did. And I think one of the things that is happening, on October the 7th, in many ways, Israel failed, but Israelis succeeded. Israelis have stepped up to the plate. And I think we need to be attuned to those lessons, particularly the younger generation, but not only. And I think there's a lot we can draw from it.
Speaking of diplomacy and of this moment, you write in your book that implacable enemies are unlikely to reach peace. And you also say that believable peace is hard, and it's complicated, and it's imperfect. So what is it that we're working towards in this moment, just to kind of expand upon that last question?
So first of all, I should say I'm happy to talk about it, but the book is actually not a book about how Israelis and Palestinians reach peace.
Fair.
It's about a much harder question. It's about how families reach peace, how organizations reach peace, how parents and children who are in very different places in their thinking about the Middle East might still somehow hold the family structure together. But I think when we think about that, I don't remember the line that you said. I think sometimes asking yourselves how we get to a final peace agreement is not the best question to be asking. I think sometimes what we need to ask ourselves are what steps we can take at this moment that will improve the lives of Israelis and Palestinians. Because the answer to the first question is going to be, it's very unlikely we're going to reach peace in the near future. But that doesn't stop us improving the situation of Israelis and Palestinians. And by the way, I think sometimes international diplomats do a disservice to peace because they come to the region and they basically say, why can't you, Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians, bang your heads together, put a line on a map, and then we'll have the signing ceremony on the White House sort of rose garden lawn. And it is so utopian that I don't think Israelis and Palestinians can buy into it. Peace is very complex. I remember one morning I was leaving to the negotiations, and one of my children saw me leaving the house with my suitcase. And he said, Abba, Daddy, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to the negotiations. He said, what are you trying to achieve? I said, peace. He said, no, seriously. And if he didn't buy into it, but I want to tell you one of the things that was truly inspiring to me. So I was the head of the Israeli side of a track of negotiations called the Culture of Peace Negotiations. And my Palestinian counterpart, Sufyan Abu Zaida, and I really didn't know how we should go about this. So I suggested to him that we travel together to Northern Ireland to see if we could learn any lessons in at the time, decade or so since the Good Friday Agreement. And we traveled, and it was an extraordinary trip. We learned a lot, but the most inspiring thing, certainly for me and I think for Sufyan, was to see how hard it was, not just to reach a peace agreement, but to keep that peace alive. Here we were, a decade or more after the Good Friday Agreement, not a single one of those peace walls separating Catholics and Protestants in Belfast had been taken down, and we were meeting people who were holding it together with sticky tape. And all of a sudden, peace seemed real to us. And I think the realization that we need to nurture is that peace is not finding a solution to all of your problems. It is changing one set of problems for a different set of problems. They're just a much better set of problems.
I'm so glad you brought this into the question of Northern Ireland as well, because when you talk about the Jewish approach to argumentation, it isn't just a question of how can this be applied to Israelis and Palestinians. It is a question of how we can apply it to our families, as you said. And in a city that feels divided, like New York City right now, in a world that feels increasingly polarized, Jewish argument, you call it not a combat zone, but a joint enterprise. Can you talk to us about how a Jewish approach to argumentation can be impactful today? Why this book? Why this moment?
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, I've been really flattered. I've had some very lovely feedback in relation to the book, but I will tell you the nicest piece of feedback that I've had. Somebody sent me a screenshot of an Instagram post by a Palestinian blogger. And the Palestinian blogger had read the book and found some of the insights to be so valuable that he was sharing them with his followers. And I just thought that was a little sign of hope. I think I think, it's almost like you asked me the question that my publisher asked me. Why is anyone going to want to read a book about the Jewish approach to argument? And I'll give you the answer that I gave to them, which is, well, I'll start slightly differently, where the idea for the book came from. I volunteer in a community mediation center in Jerusalem. And at one point, I was mediating a dispute between two Arab residents of Jerusalem. And it was becoming very heated. It looked like it was going to explode. And I had a co-mediator who is an Arab sheikh. And he turned to me and he said, "Do you mind if I depart from the mediation protocol?" And I said, "Look, there's nothing to lose here. Do whatever you like." So he stopped speaking in Hebrew. He started speaking in Arabic. And more to the point, he stopped speaking as a mediator, and he started speaking as an imam, as a religious leader. And something extraordinary happened in the room. The dynamic changed. He was channeling a Muslim tradition of sulh, of reconciliation, and it touched people in a place that I think, standard mediation wouldn't. So I started thinking, well, what tools do we have in our backpack that might help us feel that if we reach out, if we're forthcoming, we're not betraying our ancestors, but we're channeling them in some way. So I started looking into it, and in particular, I looked at that notion of constructive argument that lies at the heart of the Mishnah, of the great Jewish works, compendiums of argument, and so on, that basically developed 2,000 years ago. And the penny that dropped for me was that approach to argument was really a response to a terrible social crisis at the time of the destruction of the temple and the exile. And that social crisis resulted in people having no trust in authority, no trust in sources of information, retreating into echo chambers, increased tribalism, basically a social crisis that is strikingly similar to the social crisis that many Western societies are facing today. So the idea of this book was to dig down into what was this radical reinvention that the rabbis intuited, which basically saved the Jewish people. There were tribes at the time, Jewish sects, that disappeared into the mists of history because they didn't adopt this different approach that said we are going to welcome difference rather than continuing to try to outlaw it.
We're going to take questions at the end, not in the middle of the program, but hold on to it and we'll come to you at the end, I promise. Thank you for your patience and thank you for being here. You talk about building blocks in this book, throughout the book, of Jewish argumentation. You point to identity, you point to collaboration, you speak to communication and community. Can you take us through those building blocks and how together, in combination, they've created a uniquely Jewish approach to argumentation?
Certainly. So the first part of the book sets out some fairly radical reinventions of basic ideas that the rabbis came up with. And I'll mention just one of them. They reinvented the idea of truth. Now, that seems like a pretty drastic thing to do. But if you look at the Bible, if you want to know what truth is, if somebody wants to win an argument, it's pretty easy. A thunderbolt comes down from heaven or the ground opens up, beneath you. And if you're able to pull that off, that's a really good way of winning an argument. But when the rabbis suddenly found themselves without that ability, they had to, in a sense, move from a vertical dynamic to a horizontal dynamic. The search for truth no longer became, let's wait to hear what the prophets say or the priests say, but let us try and figure it out collaboratively together. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who I had the extraordinary privilege of studying with while I was in London, managed to summarize this in just 4 words. He said, the Jewish approach to truth is truth above, one truth on high, but truths below. Down here, our understanding of truth is always going to be partial. So the only way that we can improve our understanding is collaboratively. And there's many examples in the Bible and the Talmud and so on. But if you think about that as a fundamental conception, your attitude to the person on the other side of the table or the other side of the argument just changes. They are no longer the enemy, and they are, you might disagree with them, but they are a necessary component. I mean, it's interesting. I tried to find a good English translation of the word chavruta. Chavruta is the traditional study pairing, and the best translation I came up with was something that comes from Daniel Taub, who is the Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he talks about the fact that for many years he had a very fundamental dispute with the social scientist Gary Klein. And they decided to do something very impressive, which is they decided to work together to prepare a series of experiments that would decide which one was right. And they called this process adversarial collaboration. Because the truth, in a way, is to be found in the difference. The chewing gum magnate, Wrigley, used to say, when two men agree, one of them is unnecessary. And that's the Jewish sensibility. Probably the most famous disputing pair in Jewish history in the Talmud is Hillel and Shammai. But what people often don't know is that Hillel's first study partner wasn't Shammai. It was somebody called Menachem. And we don't know a lot about Menachem, but one of the things that we know about him is that one of the key disputes of the day, he didn't disagree with Hillel. They were on the same side. So they had to get rid of him. Because if you don't have an argument, you don't have that engine that can create wisdom.
They had to recast the role. Relationship is at the heart of Jewish disputation, with a different goal than we think of as debate, where one side wins and one side loses, and anybody who came in with their minds already made up leave with their minds still made up. What is different about Jewish argumentation? What is it that comes out of that relationship of the collaborative aspect?
So if you go online, say to Amazon, and look for books about argument, you'll find that as a rule they fall into two categories. The first category, the larger category, is books that have a title like Win Every Argument and how to make sure that you come out victorious. And the other group, which is a little bit smaller, has titles like how to have an argument-free marriage. How are you going to manage to sweep this problem back under the carpet so you can carry on drinking tea in the living room and hope it doesn't come out again? And I think the Jewish tradition pushes back very strongly against this notion of fight or flight. It insists that dynamic, that there is a strange blessing in the Talmud, which sadly we never say, but I think it's beautiful. And it's a blessing that you're supposed to say when you see a large group of people. I mean, we should say it this evening. And it thanks God for, in the same way as creating people who all have different faces, they all have different opinions. It is something to be celebrated, because in that, Rav Kook, one of the great rabbis of pre-state Israel, he had the most beautiful description of difference. He said, the difference between us is not distance, he said. It's like the space between saplings, between small trees, that need to have a certain amount of space in which each one can have the nutrients and the sunlight to grow. And I think it's an absolutely beautiful idea. I just meant this notion of an argument as not something to be silenced, but something to be nurtured. There's a really lovely story about a yeshiva student who had a question that troubled him very deeply. And he couldn't find an answer. He asked all of the rabbis in his community, none of them knew. And then one of them said, the only person who will be able to give you an answer to that question is a great sage who lives many days' travel away. So the question wouldn't let him rest, so he traveled the long journey, and then he got to the sage's house, and he went inside and he asked his question. And the sage looked at him and he said, that is truly a great question. And you want to give it up just for an answer?
We are a people of questions, not of answers. We're a people of learning, not of staying in one place. And so as the people of these questions, how can we embrace complexity, competing ideas, and difference in our conversations? How do we turn these ideas from ideals into actions?
So I have so many suggestions. I'm trying to think which of them. I would start, when I run difficult conversation laboratories, people in the first session are usually a little bit disappointed because they come along and they've rolled up their sleeves, literally or metaphorically, and they want to get into the cut and thrust of the debate. And what I say to them is, you know what? We're not ready to do that yet. We need to start by looking inwards. In any argument, we're 50% of the argument. So let's start thinking about, and some of the things that we find are actually a little bit counterintuitive. So for example, one of the things that we find is that in order to engage in a constructive argument, we don't need to dilute our identity, we need to strengthen it. We need to come into these arguments with a strong sense of who we are. Because so often what makes it difficult for us to move is that we are defining ourselves in opposition to somebody. And if we are dependent on our disagreement for our own identity, that's going to make it much harder. And then, there are many differences. One of the things that's surprising, I said at the beginning that I was surprised by how many ways the rabbis of 2,000 years ago anticipated contemporary social psychology in terms of what it means to be an active listener, what it means to ask open questions, what it means to be a storyteller. But there are still some areas where I think this body of teaching is at odds with a lot of Western thinking. And to my mind, those are the most interesting things. So for example, because the Jewish conception of learning, of aspiring to truth, is interpersonal, it means that the search for truth is not just an intellectual exercise, it's also a moral exercise. If you look in the ethics of the parents or any of the great texts at what are the qualities that are required to be a great scholar, you will find all of the regular academic resume qualities of great intellect, careful analysis, precise wording. But then you will find stuff that will not generally appear on the advert for tenure in a university, that you need to have humility, you need to have joy, you need to have a whole set of moral qualities. I love the story of Mahatma Gandhi. And one time a mother came to him with her son, and she said, the doctor has told him that he has an illness and he mustn't eat any sugar. He's not going to listen to me. Can you please, the great leader Gandhi, tell him that he should stop having sugar? And Gandhi said, go away and come back next week. So she went away, came back with her son the following week. Gandhi looked at the son and said, stop eating sugar. And she said, what? You couldn't tell me that a week ago? And he said, no, a week ago I was still eating sugar myself. And that notion that, in a way, the truth is not within us, but it can't be found without us. So we need to think about how we clear the pipes And that's a moral endeavor. I'll give just one example if I can. You asked for something practical. So one of the moral imperatives, requirements that the rabbis insist on is that when you enter into an argument, you should quote your sources. You should say who has influenced you. Now, all of us are influenced by our echo chambers, but we very rarely admit it. But if we were to enter into these rooms, our arguments, and say, I can't get rid of it, but I'm going to lift the curtain on those people who I have invisibly brought into the room with me. And it doesn't mean my positions are wrong, but if it means that all of my data and all of my opinions come from one particular news channel or one particular commentator, maybe there are other perspectives that there's an Israeli journalist, he's a right-of-center journalist called Amit Segal. And he often appears on the media with a left-of-center journalist called Amnon Abramovich. And on one occasion, Amit Segal was a little introspective, and he said, if Amnon here had grown up in a right-wing settlement like I did, and I had grown up in a left-wing kibbutz like he did, we would still be having the same arguments. We would just be each on the other side. And I think that is something that we need to recognize, that our story is not their story, and we need to bring them together.
Something else really practical that I'm taking away from your book is the emphasis in Jewish tradition on listening. The central prayer of our people, the watchword of our faith, the Shema, the Talmudic phrases, Tashema, Kamashmalan, these phrases that are all about the importance of listening, not just waiting for the time to make your point, but listening to what's actually being said and being in relationship and being in dialogue with what your dialogue partner is saying. Can you talk to us about listening for a moment?
Certainly. I'll say a word in the sources and then maybe some slightly practical suggestions. So we mentioned Hillel and Shammai, the great disputes, and in an extraordinary passage in the Mishnah, Hillel and Shammai are arguing for 3 years, and then all of a sudden a voice comes out from heaven and says, both this opinion and that opinion are the words of the living God. It's an extraordinary, they're contradictory opinions. And yet, if people remember the dresses, blue and gold, black and white, or whatever, and so on, somehow or other we are living in that dissonance. And yet, we can't live in a world that is contradictory, so we have to make a practical ruling. And so that voice from heaven continues, but the practical resolution, the opinion that we follow, is the opinion of Hillel. And why is that? And the Mishnah describes why. And it says, we follow Hillel because they listened carefully to the opinions of the other side, and quoted them before they put their own opinion. And if you think about it, it's an extraordinary statement. We choose one side of the argument to win, not because they spoke better, but because they listened better. And if you think about it, every rabbi in the Talmud, the first time we hear them, we come to know them, is when they open their mouth to speak. Except for one, except for Hillel. And I'm sure many of you know the story that he was a very poor student. He didn't have the money to get into the study hall on a cold day. And so he climbed up onto the roof and put his ear to the skylight and listened until he was covered in snow to the class that was going on below. He is the archetypal listener. And we are holding up listening. I have to say, I had a slight qualms at points writing the book, because not every lesson of Jewish tradition finds full expression in Jewish practice. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to describe the Jews as a messenger who has forgotten his message. And I think sometimes that's the case. I was involved in a dialogue between American jury and Israeli jury. I think it was organized by the General Assembly of Federations or something, and they put as the big banner and slogan for this, "Let's Talk," which is a great title, but the notion of calling it "Let's Listen" didn't really occur to them. I'll make one suggestion in terms of listening, and I think this is something that is also fairly unique to Jewish tradition and not so popular or not so common. If you go into a yeshiva and ask any kid there to tell you what they studied today in the Talmud, they will tell you what in Aramaic is called the shaklavataria, the to and fro of the argument. They will say, this rabbi says this, and then this one disagrees and brings this proof, and then another one argues like this, and so on and so forth, and the entire zigzag. He won't tell you the bottom line, because often that doesn't even appear in the Talmud. If you were to go to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and ask him, well, what happened in that important board meeting? He will tell you the bottom line decision. But all of that wisdom, all of that understanding of these highly paid executives just evaporates. Daniel Kahneman, who we mentioned earlier, advises CEOs, you should keep a decision journal to try and capture the wisdom that's getting lost. And what is a decision journal? It's the Shaklavataria. It is the Mishnah. And I want to say it is incredibly difficult. We are not trained to think like that. But if you think about a hard conversation or a hard argument, and then afterwards say, well, let me just try to reconstruct for myself how we navigated that. Maybe there are points on the other side that had value, even if they didn't at the end of the day win out in the debate. And I think that's one thing that can help steer us towards better listening.
One last thought before we open up for some questions. Machloket l'shem shamayim, the idea of a dispute, a disagreement for the sake of heaven, that we argue not because there's something bad or wrong or that there's something that needs to be corrected. We argue because it's a quest for truth, right, and relationship building. Can you just reflect for a moment on machloket l'shem shamayim, the righteousness of dialogue?
There is there's a guy in Jerusalem called David Ben Moshe, who's an interesting guy. He was not born Jewish, and he actually discovered Judaism when he was in prison, serving a term for a drug-related offense. And his cellmate had a Bible. His cellmate was Jewish, and he was very struck by the fact that the Jewish Bible looked extremely different to the Bible. He'd grown up in a black church, and their Bible was simply the text of the story of the Bible. And the Jewish Bible was, yes, you have the text, but around it you have all of these arguing across generations, commentators, thrashing backwards and forwards, and he suddenly realized that this was a tradition that welcomed diversity, that found value in diversity. If his cellmate's Bible fell to the floor, he would kiss it when he picked it up. He was kissing an argument. That is, it is the holiness. That is where we find the argument, and that is why, it's interesting. What is a successful argument? What is it? If you are one of those schools that I mentioned earlier, the fight school or the flight school, it's pretty easy. Because if it's the fight school, as long as the other side is in a quivering heap on the floor, then you won. And if you're in the flight school, then as long as you've managed to hide it back in the closet and can ignore it until it comes out again, that's a win. But the rabbis struggled with what makes a successful argument for the sake of heaven. And they said, an argument for the sake of heaven endures, continues, because it is, yes, we may need to reach a resolution like Hillel and Shammai, but it is an engine. It's an engine of creativity. It's an engine of intellectual creativity and actually of moral creativity. And one of the things that's so interesting, I mean, here is, I have to say, I think one of the strangest Jewish laws is the law that says that on Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, you are not supposed to engage in traditional Jewish study. And the reason is, it will give you too much joy. You will enjoy it too much. And there really is something about, I have a friend who is a Catholic priest, and we once did something very sweet. Each of us gave the other a tour of Jerusalem, of the old city of Jerusalem. And it turns out that very close to each other, you have, he showed me things that I would never have seen, beautiful monasteries, underground cathedrals and whatever. And then I took him into places that he had never seen, like the study hall of a yeshiva. And he was in shock. That noise, that shouting, you don't find that in the Catholic Church. He said, what are they arguing about? I said, everything. I don't know if any of you have been to Jerusalem at all recently, but the next time you go, you should do yourselves a favor and visit the new National Library of Israel, which is one of the most stunningly beautiful buildings and one of those extraordinary, beautiful oases where all the different tribes of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox and the secular and the Arabs come together and so on. But in building the library, the planners had a dilemma. Should this reading room have a hush-hush environment like a Western library, or should it have a noisy, raucous environment like a traditional Jewish study hall? And their solution was to make this incredibly beautiful, quiet reading room, but around it, it has what are called loud rooms. So if anybody feels the need, like to give a shrai, then you can go off and have your shout.
Well, now that we are all on the same page about the value of argument and the value and nature of Jewish argumentation, we would love to take some questions. Thank you so much for your patience with us. Question number one.
So
Could you say your name first?
Anastasia.
Anastasia?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So I'm a little confused. I read recently that hundreds of Jewish leaders, Israeli officials, and prominent Jewish figures, and I'm quoting, I have recently signed an open letter calling for the UN and other world leaders to impose sanctions and disseminate Israel. Do you consider this backstabbing, and how do you reconcile Jewish people going against Jewish state?
Okay, that's a really important question. I'm not sure it's a question that relates directly to the book.
It is an important question because I am confused about Jewish people.
So Anastasia, if I can maybe frame the question in terms of the argumentation, is a statement like this somehow within the bounds of Jewish argumentation, or does it exist beyond those bounds? Is it okay that I frame it that way?
Actually, it's more specific. Do you consider this backstabbing?
So the honest, I tell you, I will answer the question as best as I can. I haven't seen the letter. I don't know the context of the letter. I can't. No. Yeah, afterwards, you're welcome to email me and so on. But I do think the question is a broader question, and one that is very relevant is, at what point do we consider an opinion to be illegitimate? How do we decide that a position, whether it's backstabbing or illegitimate for any other reason? The thrust of Jewish teaching, and I would say the thrust of my book, is that we should be welcoming, we should call people in rather than call them out. But clearly that cannot be the only principle at play. As one American academic said, you don't want your mind to be so open that all your brains fall out. So, or if you ask the question in Jewish terms, the fact is the rabbis used to say there are 70 faces to the Torah. There are 70 different ways of looking at anything in Torah, But that doesn't mean that there can't be a 71st face or a 72nd face, and that is something that's outside the bounds of legitimacy. So how do you decide? And I think there are a number of principles, but one that I think is really helpful that comes from my study of the Talmud. You know, if you read the Talmud, it's very rare, but on occasion there are rabbis who are thrown out of the study hall. And you look at the reason why they were thrown out of the study hall, and almost never was it because of what they said. Almost always it was because they did not buy into the rules of the debate. It was an issue of process and not an issue of content. So, you know, that sort of suggests to me that in our debates, we should challenge ourselves to hear opinions that are uncomfortable to us until somebody says there is no amount of evidence that you could bring that would make me change my mind. You know, amongst diplomats, there's a saying sometimes, you can make me change my opinion, but you can't change my instructions. So if you're speaking to somebody who basically is acting in accordance with instructions, you know, from their tribe, from their social circle and so on, that's the point where I think you should probably be saying, cutting your losses and investing your energies elsewhere.
Additional questions? I'm going to call in some folks who are raising their hands. Dagan, and we're going to take the question in the first row. I thank you so much for your patience.
This is both a...
So you are?
Doran or Doron.
Doron.
Yes. So a statement is and a question combined. One of the great influences of the Talmud on Western jurisprudence is something that most people are not really aware of, and that is we look at Supreme Court decisions in the United States, 7 judges, and we have a majority opinion, and we have a dissenting opinion and a concurring opinion. And we take it for granted, most of us, that of course we can see the opinion of both. That is not common in many, many civilizations. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they made sure to destroy the views of the opponents. In our judicial system, we have inherited exactly what the Talmud did, which is to memorialize and make permanent the opposing views that supposedly lost the argument, which I've often said to non-Jews, it's one of the great, great qualities, I think, of Judaism. Turning it into a question, I would say, to what degree do you think that the level of discussion in Israel today, or in America, or amongst American Jews, respects the underlying premise of that approach, which is some kind of a fundamental respect for the other side? Or do we just print the view of the other side, but then trash it?
So thank you so much. First of all, I think, Doron, the point that you made is a really important one. These great texts that have become the lifeblood of Jewish intellectual tradition could not exist without dissent. And you know, I think about, you talk about the Supreme Court, I think about the statement of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she said, you know, dissents are written for another age. And that's really, we keep them as part of the body because, as the Mishnah said, they may not have won the day today, but there is a wisdom within them, and it may well be in the future that we will need to come to rely on them. I think within Israeli society, I can't comment on American society, I think with Israeli society, there is actually more points of light than we see, but sadly the prisms through which Israeli society is reflected tend to hide them. First of all, I mentioned it in terms of our negotiations, then I'll come back to Israeli society. When I was involved in the negotiations I was talking about, I would have journalists come to me and they would say, can you tell us what's going on in the negotiating room? And I would say, I'm, you know, the culture of peace negotiations. I said, look, I'm not allowed to talk about what's going on inside the room, but I can tell you about or introduce you to extraordinary Israelis and Palestinians who are reaching out to each other in really moving ways, bereaved families and so on. And again, the response I got was, nobody wants to read about good Israelis and good Palestinians. There's no story there. And it's terribly sad. And I do think that the media and those structures take a toll. In my life, and I'm sure many of you, I have probably listened to and watched tens of thousands of hours of talking heads, television and radio. And if you were to ask me, do I ever remember anyone changing their mind about anything? I'm not sure that I can. I mean, I was interviewed in London not long ago by a reporter who told me that he had been invited to be a panelist on a very popular show in the UK on the BBC that is called The Moral Maze, where a group of panelists state their opinions in relation to big moral issues. They bring in experts and discuss and so on. And he said, I did it for a couple of times, and then I got fired. And I said, why were you fired? He said, because I changed my mind. And the producer came up to me and said, you can't do that. He said, but this expert came in. I thought he made a really good point. And so that's, I changed my mind. But the entire format was based on but it's, for example, I mean, the Knesset is not usually a model of argument for the sake of heaven. But the honest truth is, if you go into the back rooms of the Knesset and see the members of Knesset talking about issues that are not necessarily the most hot-button issues that their constituencies care about, they have discussions. Funny enough, I was just in Yale yesterday. I think I can say this because and the journey back into England, the journey back into New York, I spent with Stav Shafir. Stav Shafir is an absolutely extraordinary young Israeli politician. You might remember her if you remember the social protests in Israel many years ago against the cost of living. She was the firebrand that started them. She has bright red hair. She's very brilliant, very, very secular. And she told me how many pieces of important legislation she managed to pass through cooperation with the ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset. And that is something that you simply would not see, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why when, for example, I'm approached by families and say, how can we have better conversations? The first piece of advice that I give them is take it offline. Your extended family WhatsApp group is not the best place to have this conversation. It's not the best conversation to have at Seder night when all the uncles and aunts and cousins are there. You need to try and create the environment where the personal price for recognizing that there may be room for you to operate, maneuver, adjust your thinking is as reduced as possible. So I do think there are those moments. I'll tell you something else. I mean, for example, within Israeli society, there's something else that I've noticed. It's only a very small thing, but I draw some hope from it. Sometimes when people who don't know each other begin to get in a conversation, there is this tiny moment of hesitation. And in that moment of hesitation, I think they are thinking, I don't know this person, but maybe they are related to one of the hostages. Maybe they are related to one of the families that was evacuated from the north or the south. Maybe they have a close relative who was injured or worse on one of the fronts on which we're fighting. And I think there's something holy in that moment of silence, where we recognize that if their story was our story, we might be thinking about these things differently.
So we've come to our final few minutes. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we're going to take, so I see two hands. We're going to take both questions and then come to a final few answers. So a question up front and a question in the back.
Follow up. Oh, I'm sorry. I just want to follow up on what the young lady just said. Hear your response. One of the people that signed that letter was Avram Berg, who I'm sure you're very familiar with. You could tell the audience who he is. Okay, how do you look at Avram Berg signing a letter that's basically not only a boycott of Israel, but an arms embargo of Israel? Now, is that crossing the line, like she said? Is that being seditious or treason or a traitor?
So that's our first question, and we're going to take our second question, and then we'll have our answers.
All the way in the back?
All the way in the back, yeah.
Hello, great program. I'm looking forward to reading the book. My question for you is, as a mediator, and you value ongoing dispute, what is your goal in the room when you're mediating? Are you trying to achieve just understanding and good conversation, or what else is the goal?
That's such a great question. So again, I'm hesitant to pass judgment on people, and I want to make two comments that are slightly contradictory. I think particularly when Israel is facing an existential crisis, facing a war on 7 fronts, has the number of people injured, has the depth of strategic concerns that we have, it is certainly the case that there are people whose calls to deprive Israel of the means that it needs to defend itself have to be treated in a way as enemies of the state of Israel. And I don't rule that out. But I want to say something else, which is that I would urge ourselves to stretch as far as possible to see whether there is some element, if not legitimacy, of at least value in terms of what these opinions are, and to see whether we can find a way to turn these into learning conversations. I was very struck. I read a book by Van Jones, who I'm sure some of you know. He's a CNN correspondent. He was politically active on the Democratic Party. And one of the things that he says in the book that surprised me was that early in his career, he was very friendly with Newt Gingrich, which is not a friendship that you would normally have imagined. And he said it was Newt Gingrich that taught him that your 90% enemy can still be your 10% friend. And, you know, it's actually very similar to something that the Lubavitcher Rebbe once said. He said, somebody said, how can you speak to that, you know, progressive Jewish leader who is so different from you on this fundamental issue? And he said, look, we disagree on one of the 613 commandments. There are still 612 where we can find common ground. So first of all, thank you so much for the question about mediation. It's really important. And obviously, a mediator, in a sense, wants to do something that is a little bit different to what I'm talking about here. Because a mediator is not going onto the room saying, let me stoke up the fires of difference so we can come out with new levels of knowledge and new levels of understanding. The thing that I would say about mediation, I think they want to help the two sides understand their positions. They want to help them understand their own positions, to understand the positions of the other side, and to explore whether there are areas. I mean, one of the things that is so often the case is that we confuse our positions and our interests. Because often the position that we are presenting doesn't really reflect our genuine interest. It's interesting, there is in negotiation courses, and I'm sure many of you will have heard it, often the story that is told is of a parent that comes along and finds their children fighting over an orange. And what the parent does is cut the orange in half and give half each. But then he watches the children, and sees that one of them takes the peel of the orange to make jam, jelly out of it, and the other takes the pith, the inside, to make juice, and realizes that, in fact, instead of giving each side 50%, he could have given them 100% of what it was they wanted. Now, that story sounds pretty childish and impractical, but in fact, that was the basis of some of Israel's peace agreements. If you think about Israel's peace agreement with Egypt after the 1973, the Yom Kippur War, both sides said that they wanted to have the Sinai Desert. But in fact, when the negotiators dug down, they realized that what Egypt really wanted was to be able to claim sovereignty over the Sinai Desert. And what Israel wanted was to make sure that it could never be used to attack Israel. So to say we're going to call it Egyptian sovereign territory, but we're going to have it demilitarized with a multinational force and so on and so forth, is basically splitting the pith from the peel. So I think one thing that the mediator is, but let me say something that I think the mediator often shouldn't do. And I think it relates in a way to we talked about an argument enduring, continuing. Mediators are often advised not to propose solutions to the conflict, because the research very interestingly shows that if a mediator makes a proposal, it actually does increase the chances that the two sides will sign a proposal. But if you carry on and follow them afterwards, it decreases the chance that that solution will actually be implemented, because the two sides lose their sense of ownership over the solution that they've come to. So I think mediators need to enter the room with a tremendous amount of humility.
I want to thank all of you for choosing to show up at Central Synagogue to listen, to learn, to engage in our ongoing dialogue around Israel, around Judaism, around tradition and identity. We're really grateful to all of you for being here. And Ambassador Taub, Daniel, thank you for being our teacher this evening. Thanks. Have a great evening.
That was so lovely. Thank you.